In part 5 of this series on the history of our mind control, we dealt with the 70s and the events around Richard Nixon. The 70s was a major time period in the history of our world. We saw the beginning foundations to the main catalyst that is going to reset the world and bring the change that's coming. That being the time where the United States dollar was taken off the gold standard and the world would be carefully guided into a new age where they would be changing the world. That information was important because in order to see where we are today, we had to understand the important events that got us here. Right now, currently, as we speak, the world is ditching the United States dollar, but the majority of American citizens are oblivious of it because they don't have a clue about the foundations that this country is currently standing on. The period in the 70s was the period that very much set the stage for the new world to come, and the decades that followed all were directly influenced by the 70s. But after the 80s comes, it seems that the 70s was a decade that's lost and not spoken about in great detail. When you hear people speak today, we speak about the 80s and the 90s, but many people seem to leave the 70s alone, and I believe that that's intentional. The decade of the 80s was when the mindset of the world began to shift into pure fiction, and more than ever, our lives were directed by the idiot box that was in over 95% of our homes in America at the time. Being that we are in a time period where we are speaking about selecting our next president, it is fitting that we discuss a thought that has deceived us and controlled us consistently. Believers in this world as a whole have done something very wrong, and for the most part, it's not even recognized. Many of us unknowingly have replaced our source and who we depend on, and put our lives in the hands of men and now women whom we have been given as leaders by an evil authority. Over time, we have been directed into what they want to call a democracy, and all of us all over the world have been given our minds, our hearts, our trust, and our dependency over to leaders that we believe actually are in control. It is a part of the overall mindset that is a part of the matrix that we all have been controlled by. The matrix is a very powerful weapon used by our enemy. It keeps many asleep, living in a dream world that they believe is reality. It makes them believe they have more power than they actually do. It keeps people from living through the true power that our Creator has given us and keeps us sedated and defenseless against our enemy. The office of the presidency has been a strong tool in the matrix, which keeps us tied to this system while every 4 years or so resetting our hopes and alliance to this system. It is a constant mental cycle that those that control this world have worked very hard to keep us attached to. If you followed this mind control series, you can see how they navigated the general public through their agendas by the changing of leaders. As agendas changed, so did the leaders. After the agenda of the 70s was carried out through Nixon, the rest of the 70s was not about pushing agendas more than keeping the public with hope and moving them along through the transition. The 1980s was a major decade of change, of transition. The whole function of the United States was changing in the world. It went from a manufacturing economy to a consumer-driven economy. It went from being a nation of low debt to trillions in debt. And this was not just by the government, but by the public as well. The masses became even more targeted and were given different avenues that they could be directed towards. The mind control became more diverse and the country became more segmented. This all started in the 1980s. All this change would not be possible if it were not for the biggest mental change agent presented to the world. Ronald Reagan is literally the poster child of a leader that was put in the faces of the public in order to steer everyone through the transition. He was the face of change in the world. He became the symbol of what American strength is to this day. In reviewing this series, if we do not start this decade off with understanding the transition into Ronald Reagan, we will be leaving out one of the biggest parts of the mental programming that is still leading us to this day. Ronald Reagan became the face of evangelical Christians in America. He became the roadmap of strength and leadership in America. And all this would be very powerful and inspirational if it were actually real. After we got through the 70s, now that the systems of the world were built, and America was now being led into the transition as well, they called upon an actor that already had the trust of the minds before he ever took office. The powers that be called upon and selected an actor from the genre of the Westerns when movies and televisions were the first tool to gain trust and mental dependence from the American audience.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it. I'll shoot the first man who starts for those steps.
They went back and cashed in on the mental program they started with, and were able to bring about a leader that would lead them through a period of hope and transition that has brought us to the very moment in time that we are in today. As we discuss mind control coming into the 1980s, we must first discuss the face of this mind control through the front man, the great communicator, Ronald Reagan. Let's begin. Okay, so we can't just jump into the 80s without understanding the conditions that led us into the decade. So again, we briefly need to start in the 70s. Like we discussed in part 5, in the 1970s, the economics of the country were very bad. This period is known as the Great Inflation of the 1970s. Inflation was like a roller coaster going up and down in the 70s. From 1970 to 1981, the average inflation rate in the United States was nearly 8% per year. In that period, there were 4 recessions. We know about this from what we spoke about in part 5 with Nixon removing the dollar off the gold standard. There were major adjustments that the United States was going through. Gerald Ford, who we spoke about in part 5, was just a one-term president that helped the general public move on from Richard Nixon. He lost his second campaign running against Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, who, when he came on the scene, was marketed as another change agent, someone who would bring in change. Jimmy Carter took office during a period of stagflation, which is when the economy experiences a combination of high inflation and slow economic growth, a very bad time. And that led to the Carter years. By the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, inflation went up to 14%. Interest rates ran up to 20%. In 1979, there was an energy crisis that set the country off. Like I said, things were very bad. These are reasons why people seem to want to forget the decade of the 70s. And so, Ronald Reagan came on the scene. But we must go back to Jimmy Carter first. When he came on the scene, this is the year when Gerald Ford declared the State of the Union was not good.
That the State of the Union is not good.
This was because inflation was again a major problem of the 70s. Jimmy Carter, a former one-term governor from Georgia, came out of nowhere and announced his presidency. No one knew who he was. They chose him specifically for that reason. In the eyes of the general public, he was looked at as a political outsider, and that's what the public was looking for due to the mind control between Nixon and Ford when Ford pardoned Nixon after the scandal. Jimmy Carter was looked at as a fresh start. He also was looked at as being deeply religious. He prayed in public. He spoke openly on his religious beliefs. He was known as America's first born-again president. He was looked at as one who was going to be leading the country through a sort of spiritual redemption. As you understand this, I want you to remember that the values of the country were changing rapidly. This was at the time of the sexual revolution. Carter was used to bring back the mind control that this country believed it was actually a Christian nation. Carter brought white Protestant evangelicals in with him. Like I said, he was known as the first born-again president. And being that morals were changing so rapidly in the country from the change in culture, with feminism, the sexual revolution, drugs, and just a change in overall values, the public mentally chose Carter. This was not by accident, but orchestrated. Now, when Carter was presented, Ronald Reagan also came on the scene at that time, running as a presidential candidate against Ford. But it wasn't his time yet. They let him lose to Ford because he would have beaten Carter. They used him the same way they used Nixon against Kennedy. When they introduced him, it was just to let you know that Ronald Reagan was up, but it was not his time yet. Carter beat Ford. In the eyes of the public, he was looked at in the same mind control that they keep using against us. Hope. But you must understand the backdrop. The people truly in charge knew that things were not ready to be fixed yet. The changes that Nixon brought forward with moving the dollar off the gold standard would take time to cement. It took about 15 years. Jimmy Carter was only placed in the White House to buy more time and sell more reason to have hope. This is the game they play with the role of the president. Jimmy Carter was not actually in office to fix the economy, but he was there to be the face of foreign policy in the Middle East, and they used his faith as a reason of justification for this. There was war between the Arabs and Israel, and the real power in the world was shaping the Middle East for the time that we're in right now. You can read and learn all about what Jimmy Carter was said to be doing when he took his trips in the Middle East, or when he hosted a summit bringing leaders of the Middle East to the United States for a summit. This is when he was promoted as bringing Egyptian President Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem to discuss peace in the Middle East. It was at this time in 1978 they signed a peace treaty. Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist. And this whole agenda began the conflict we now have with Iran, who before all of this were once allies with the United States. Before this, Ayatollah Khomeini was an Iranian priest who was exiled from Iran living in Paris. He rejected the peace treaty and called for his supporters to build an Islamic state not dependent on the West. This was all in public view, but you will not truly understand what was actually happening behind the scenes unless you read about it from other sources, particularly in David Rockefeller's book, Memoirs, in chapter 24, when he speaks about the Shah in Iran. When you understand the dealings that these power brokers were making in the Middle East and around the world, you will see that what you see happening in the public with our presidents is not truly what is influencing the decisions of this world. If you listen in the mainstream of how they say that the peace treaty with Egypt and Israel came to be, you can clearly see they are playing with our minds.
On one occasion when Begin was completely committed to leave, I carried some photographs of his grandchildren over. And I had found the name of all 8 grandchildren. I had written them on the photograph. Begin looked at them in a perfunctory way, and then he saw the name of his little children, whom he loved, and we started talking about our grandchildren and how the world might affect them adversely if we couldn't find peace. He changed his mind and decided to stay.
Anyways, the conflict that started with Iran created an energy crisis in the United States that brought great pains to the last years of the 70s. 1979. There was no gas and inflation skyrocketed. When you hear of an energy crisis, you may think in terms of corporations or countries in the Middle East. But that again is mind control. When you actually know and understand how this world works and who actually started the energy industry in the first place, you can understand who is really behind the crisis. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which was later forced to split up into many different companies that are still strong today, companies like Exxon and Chevron, they dominated the energy industry around the world. You see, our mind control wants us to look at corporations in Arab nations, but this view does not allow you to see the true hand of who was guiding and directing these crises. The public expected Carter to fix these things because they did not have a clue of really how this world works. And this is the same issue that we see plagues us today. People are so mind-controlled to believe that the government truly has the power to fix and change things. This is why they have been following their leaders to hell. It's mind control. Now, look at what Carter came on to say in regards to the energy crisis.
So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. It is a crisis of confidence. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. 2/3 of our people do not even vote. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
When he did this, the media said it was almost a sermon. But if you look at it objectively, you can see that he was not there to fix things. He was there for the mental programming of keeping us, the general public, in their web of control. Look at the world today. Do you think people have woken up to this? But anyways, the media again controlled the minds of the public, and people began to hate Carter even more. Towards the end of 1979, the Shah of Iran was admitted to the United States for medical treatment for cancer. And it was this event that started the main conflict we now have with Iran. It was at this time when Iranians took hostages from the United States Embassy in Iran. Iranians burning the United States flag and saying they would keep the hostages until the United States sent the Shah back to Iran. To understand this, let me read you an excerpt from David Rockefeller's book, like I mentioned earlier, in chapter 24, page 366. That same evening, I had dinner with Henry Kissinger and Happy Rockefeller, Nelson's widow, at her home in Pocantico. Henry and I discussed our telephone calls from David Newsom and the Shah's plight. Happy told me of Nelson's close friendship with the Shah and about the weekend they had spent with him and Farah Diba, the Shah's wife, in Tehran in 1977. Happy reminded me that when the Shah realized he would have to leave Iran, Nelson offered to find a suitable property for him in the United States. We also talked about the precedent that President Carter had established by refusing to admit the Shah into the United States. Both of us believed our allies, particularly those in the Middle East such as Sadat and King Hussein, who had taken great risk on our behalf, were likely to entertain second thoughts about the dependability of the United States in light of this action. In view of these concerns and Nelson's offer, Henry and I agreed to do what we could to help the Shah while the Carter administration continued to mull over whether and under what circumstances he might be admitted to the United States. Now, as I said before, I do not listen to these ridiculous explanations. But what I'm trying to show you is that while the public believes that it was the United States government bringing in the Shah to the United States for help, it was actually the Rockefeller family who directed this. This is one event, but what the public believes was happening is quite different than the reality. This is evidence of mind control. I'm just slowly walking you through this so you can see how the general public was steered. And so from this, Iranians have United States hostages, and what is the first thing that Carter does? He says that the United States will no longer buy oil from Iran.
It is necessary to eliminate any suggestion that economic pressures can weaken our stand on basic issues of principle. Our position must be clear. I am ordering that we discontinue purchasing of any oil from Iran for delivery to this country.
Again, it being all about energy. And so at the end of 1979, there was high inflation, an energy crisis, no gas at the gas stations, overwhelming poverty in the Negro community, and the United States was looking weak in regards to foreign policy. This was the ending of the decade of the 70s. If you go through the history of that decade of the 70s, it is very easy to see that the puppet masters used the 70s as a period of setting up their chessboard. They moved their pieces in line to set up the world that we are alive in today. All the major problems that we face today, except the debt problem, which will start in the 80s, all the other problems that are coming to a head right now were set up in the 1970s. The collapse of the United States dollar started in the 70s when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. The challenge of China against the United States started when Nixon brought China on the world stage. This is when manufacturing was brought to Asia and out of the United States. Well, that happened in the 80s too, but all this was the setup for it. More on that later. The conflict with Iran, that started in the 70s with Carter and the peace treaty with Israel and Egypt, and also the building up on Middle East oil. And let's not forget our morals and values declining all started directly in the 70s. This was the decade that set all this up. It was not by coincidence or just a matter of certain circumstances. It was all directed and orchestrated in order to bring us into the world that we currently are in today. The problem is that the general public is not able to see it in this way, which is why they are still being guided and directed by these people and these agendas. This was all mind control that we, the general public, were strategically being directed through. Understand, they could have done all these things anyway and told us the truth about what they were doing. But they put these smoke and mirrors up in order to distract us and guide us in a certain way. They were mentally manipulating us for decades, and it was all possible because of this first device that they put in all of our homes, the television. Now they were able to tell their story and make us believe what they wanted us to believe, while we never really questioned any of it, because we never knew any better. This is not all of our faults. Well, I'll definitely pass blame to the pastors who claim to be teachers and preachers of the word, because they could have kept a great deal of us from all of this by telling their flock to be set apart and not to be of this world. But the mind control was already set from the civil rights era that everyone's objective in life was to be a part of this world system and try to obtain this world by any means. But for you all that were alive back then, this is not a slight on you. You don't know what you don't know. The books I read today, like the memoirs from Rockefeller, it was not published back then, and there were other books like The Unseen Hand, but they probably were not pushed into your hands. so it is understandable how we all were caught up in their web of lies. We cannot dwell on these mistakes. The problem is not yesterday, though, but today. Though there is reasonable justification and understanding of our collective ignorance, that justification and excuse is not valid today because the information is out there. It's just that people choose to be under the strong delusion because they love the lie. I am making this series so it can help wake up whoever it is our Father wills. You must recognize how much you have been mentally manipulated and steered if you're going to break free from it. Let's keep going. The Iran hostage crisis went on in the news for hundreds of days. Carter began to be the president that lost American prestige in the world, and it was at this time when we see Ronald Reagan come on the scene again, declaring his candidacy for president.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ronald Reagan.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States. I'm sure that each of us has seen our country from a number of viewpoints, depending on where we've lived and what we've done. For me, it's been as a boy growing up in several small towns in Illinois, as a young man in Iowa trying to get a start in the years of the Great Depression, and later in California for most of my adult life. I've seen America from the stadium press box as a sportscaster, as an actor, officer of my labor union, soldier, office holder, and as both Democrat and Republican. I've lived in an America where those who often had too little to eat outnumbered those who had enough. There have been 4 wars in my lifetime, and I've seen our country face financial ruin in the Depression. I've also seen the great strength of this nation as it pulled itself up from that ruin to become the dominant force in the world. To me, our country is a living, breathing presence, unimpressed by what others say is impossible, proud of its own success, generous, yes, and naive. Now, there are those in our land today, however, who would have us believe that the United States, like other great civilizations of the past, has reached the zenith of its power, that we're weak and fearful, reduced to bickering with each other, and no longer possessed of the will to cope with our problems. Much of this talk has come from leaders who claim that our problems are too difficult to handle. We're supposed to meekly accept their failures as the most which can humanly be done. They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been, that the America of the coming years will be a place where, because of our past excesses, it will be impossible to dream and make those dreams come true. I don't believe that, and I don't believe you do either. That's why I'm seeking the presidency.
That boy is good.
Now understand that when you see this man come on the scene, who was both Democrat or Republican at one point, understand that this is the time that we are about to go even stronger into the matrix. You see, this man was an actor. When really understanding, you truly don't know what his actual thoughts were compared to what he was actually dictated to do. Understand that you never really see him speak without reading his thoughts that were written for him to say. Matter of fact, this goes for all presidents. They read speeches, but you're never in the back room with them and see how it all goes down, who's actually directing them. But if by now, watching part 6 of this series, you don't see the control that the unseen hand of this world has had over our leaders, you may never understand and break free from the mind control. Anyways, they brought in an actor known as the Great Communicator. When you listen to Reagan, you can see why they chose him. He seemed trustworthy.
I tell you that I believe with all my heart that our first priority must be world peace, and that use of force is always and only a last resort when everything else has failed.
He was clear and exuded strength. He was always looked at as exuding strength from the time he did Westerns. Reagan was a president of transition. During his time from his loss to Ford, he was being primed for the role he was going to take in the 80s. He brought in Christian fundamentalists and brought back conservative values to the Republican Party. He revived the party after Nixon, which is why all Republicans always mention trying to be like him. I want you to think about it. When Republicans speak, they always go back to Reagan.
American civics and the Constitution in our schools in a really big way, just like President Reagan asked for in his farewell address back in 1989.
This is a time for those of us that have the experience, the tested experience, and a commitment to the conservative agenda that Ronald Reagan brought forward in this party. As I said at the top of this debate, whether we're going to stand on the foundation of that conservative agenda that Ronald Reagan poured, or whether we're going to follow.
We're going to do it in a state-by-state direction. And why? Because as Reagan said in his day, this is our time for choosing.
He was the blueprint that the current Republican Party still tries to hold on to. He brought the white Protestant Christians back to the Republican Party. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here. But I want you to think about something. In our most recent Republican debates, that Tim Scott character, he would always annoyingly say the same thing about America being the shiny city on the hill. He said it all the time.
A racist country. Never, ever doubt who we are. We are the greatest country on God's green earth. And frankly, the city on the hill needs a brand new leader. And it's restoring faith, restoring our Christian values that will help this nation once again become the city on the hill. We have to get back to being a nation that is, in fact, the city on the hill. That by having an energy economy, we start allowing this nation to once again return.
Senator, thank you. Let me ask the same question.
Understand, this did not come from him, nor was it a religious thought. He was just grabbing the programming from Reagan. This is what they all did.
John Winthrop said, "We shall be a city upon a hill. For I believe that Americans in 1980 are every bit as committed to that vision of a shining city on a hill as were those long ago settlers. We did protect and pass on lovingly that shining city on a hill."
Or what about this famous line?
Let us pledge to each other, with this great lady looking on, that we can, and so help us God, we will make America great again. Thank you very much.
Can you see the mind control? Ronald Reagan won by a landslide against Carter. And the mind control from the Christian Protestant pastors in America now are bringing the Christian values into the Republican Party like never before. The party of Ronald Reagan began to define what we know as Christian values in America. The basis of Christianity in America today, within white America, is built off the foundation of Ronald Reagan.
Has spread the word of God to every corner of the globe and made him one of the most inspirational spiritual leaders of the 20th century. As a deeply committed Christian, his challenge to accept Jesus Christ has lifted the hearts, assuaged the sorrows, and renewed the hopes of millions. Billy Graham is an American who lives first and always for his fellow citizens. In honoring him, we give thanks for God's greatest spiritual gifts, faith, hope, and love.
And so if you ever want to understand the foundation of the beliefs in Christianity within the Caucasian segment of the United States population, you will find that their beliefs were built not from a strong biblical revolution, but from a leader who declared belief in God and spoke about the Bible in a general sense, and to gain the trust of the public. It's important to mention and note that this was not the mind control that was directed in the Negro community, because since Michael King, 90% of the Negroes in America voted Democrat. Their Christian faith was tied to the Democrats. But if you look right now and you see the divide in Christianity today, and you want to understand how there could be such a divide in what is known as Christian values, this divide started when Reagan took over the party. Now, it could be obvious that certain Republican conservative values align more with Scripture than does liberal Democrats. But the white Christian Republicans were completely mind controlled to a false Christian religion just as much as the Negro Democratic Christians, all because they were following politics and false leaders more than they were following the word. Because while some issues and stances that the Republican Party takes can be based upon a biblical understanding, they definitely are trapped in idolatry, which is why the rich are tied to the Republican Party. But we'll get to more of that when we deal with money and what happened in the 80s in regards to Reagan and greed. I'm just saying there is a level of hypocrisy that is not seen. Christian values were tied to Ronald Reagan, and this was all mind control thought. That's all I'm trying to say. They used Reagan to make Christian values political, and therefore, later on, as they began to bring about political divide, they cleverly got the Negroes in the country to choose politics over their faith, and it has been disastrous for them ever since. This was all mental manipulation. But anyways, let's get to Reagan. I want you to look at how this all went down. Ronald Reagan was elected in a landslide victory against Carter and inaugurated on January 20th, 1981.
Let us take inventory. We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It does require, however, our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you. Thank you very much.
And right after Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office, they released the hostages that they had from Iran. They held the hostages for 444 days, and they were released the minute Ronald Reagan took office.
Now, day one. Day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today. The new president had not been in office an hour when the former hostages became free men and women again. And they are well along now on their trip to West Germany and eventually to home.
This was theater. The whole last year of the Carter administration was defined by the hostage crisis. And the beginning of Ronald Reagan's presidency, they're free. And it brings more assurance to the mind-controlled public that they were in a season of change. So now that Iran crisis is over, Ronald Reagan focuses on the economy, which is what he was put in office to do. He was directing the country in a new shift and transition that they did not recognize was happening. During the 70s, the country and the world went through a major shift. We know about the dollar moving off the gold standard, but also what happened in the 70s was the buildup to the economies in Asia when American companies began to send their products to China to be manufactured. In the 40s through the 60s, the economy of the United States was built on manufacturing. This is how it grew in strength. During the 70s, when Nixon visited China, they started transitioning the world without telling everyone. On February 5th, 1981, shortly after he was inaugurated, Ronald Reagan gave a speech about the economy in which he told everyone that things were bad.
Good evening. I'm speaking to you tonight to give you a report on the state of our nation's economy, and regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. A few days ago, I was presented with a report I'd asked for, a comprehensive audit, if you will, of our economic condition. You won't like it. I didn't like it. But we have to face the truth and then go to work to turn things around. And make no mistake about it, we can turn them around.
Yes, he said all that, but he also spoke in terms of hope. You can see that they chose this actor because of all the mind control that he was a part of during his early days as an actor with those westerns. He already had trust from the public, and the campaign around him continued with that assurance. The United States economy was in the worst economic condition since the Great Depression because the economy was being transitioned. If you actually truly understand what they changed during Nixon, it would be quite clear that it would not be presidential policy that changed things. It was a tightening by the Federal Reserve as well as the shifting of what the American economy would be valued by. But of course, this was not communicated to the public because this did not go with their agenda and their narrative. They brought Ronald Reagan in at the time when they needed to smoothly transition the country through all of this. Reagan came on with the plan that Republicans own to this day, deregulation. It's now called Reaganomics. It was a plan of increasing defense spending, balancing the federal budget, and slowing the growth of government spending. Reagan reduced the federal income tax and capital gains tax, reduced government regulation, and tightened the money supply in order to reduce inflation. This was the plan. But on paper, in reality, it was quite different. Spending during the years of Reagan, 1982 to 89, averaged 21.6% GDP, roughly tying with President Obama for the highest among any recent president. In addition, the public debt rose from 26% GDP in 1980 to 41% GDP by 1988. In dollar terms, the public debt rose $712 billion in 1980 to over $2 trillion in 1988. This is what the Reagan presidency brought in. Anyways, from the start of his presidency, he took on the economy by saying he was attacking inflation. Now, the reality was that there was nothing that he could do except what he was told to do. He wasn't tackling inflation. The Federal Reserve was tackling inflation, which is why interest rates at that time were at 20%. But that's not what the general public needed to understand. He came in to be the face of the policies that would take the regulations off American business and let them run through debt. At that time, America was considered to be in decline because they were dealing with stagflation. Again, high inflation with low growth. And there was also high unemployment. Reagan was put in office to simply be the face of change. Today, they label his plan as a good plan because of what happened later. But it was masked by debt. What he was actually doing was starting to run up the debt of the United States government by using the great name it built over the past 40 years. He reduced the taxes on the rich and said that by freeing them up to spend would then bring in more money. This obviously was not true, as our debt skyrocketed for the first time under him. But because economically things started to feel better for the public, they did not realize what the transition was. The United States went from being a nation that manufactured things to be a country that consumed things. And the more we consumed, the better we did. Donald Trump, when he came in office, he tried to emulate the mind control of Ronald Reagan as much as he could while he was in office. He tried to do the same things Reagan did. Anyways, after Ronald Reagan came on the scene as president, he still had critics, especially with his plan of deregulation. Remember, the public already lost trust in the government because of Nixon and Ford. This was how an unknown, one-term governor like Carter and an actor like Reagan were even accepted. His plan to deregulate and cut taxes for the rich was not going to be accepted without an agenda that was brought through mental manipulation. Because what his plan was about to do was bring about the biggest separation the country ever saw between the rich and the poor, while keeping the middle class hoping they could be like the rich. When his plan was introduced to lower taxes on the rich and remove regulations from them, it was met by opposition. But again, this was theater. On March 30th, 1981, only 2 months after being in office, Reagan was shot.
And shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan as he was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon. The president was not hit.
The information was not complete. President Ronald Reagan was hit by gunshot. 3 others were also wounded. As President Reagan was driven away, gunman John Hinckley Jr. was wrestled to the ground.
He was wounded. My God. The president was hit. He is in stable condition. All this information. The president was hit.
What do you think was happening here? What did they do? Yeah, they tapped into and attacked a public that was traumatized almost 20 years ago with Kennedy, and they went right back at that trauma. They took advantage of people's trauma. After Reagan survived the shot, there was a sense of unity from all sides. Of course, at this time now, there was no more political disagreement. Reagan's approval numbers skyrocketed. Not because he did anything that fixed their problems, but because of trauma. Soon as he came out, he went directly back to his agenda and said they need to get his agenda passed. And on April 28th, he speaks before Congress addressing his program for economic recovery.
You wouldn't want to talk me into an encore, would you? Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and fellow citizens, I have no words to express my appreciation for that greeting. I have come to speak to you tonight about our economic recovery program and why I believe it's essential that the Congress approve this package.
He was met with a round of applause. He was looked at as an American hero. A couple of months later, in June, his second push to Congress, there was no more opposition. They passed his agenda, and the budget and tax cuts were signed into office that brought about the changes in the country that we are living through right now. And it is from this point where Reagan was solidified in the minds of the public, and over the next 7 years, he was the face of the transition that brought us into deep idolatry. But he was the face of it, and how he got there was a part of deep mental manipulation and programming. As we start waking up to the reality of our world we live in today, we can see clearly a little bit more about where we are today and how things are. But what's lost from us is how we actually got here. If you actually go back and study all these events with eyes of doubt and now living in reality of how things actually work, you can see the mental warfare that was being waged against us. The way we are right now is not by accident. It was a carefully guided agenda that has brought us into an agenda that desires to bring about a new world. We are just pawns in their game that are being used to create the energy and acceptance of the coming beast. For those that were alive during this time, this should help you go back in your thoughts and review the history of your own life and review how you were guided personally. Look back at how the decisions you made were directed. All these events mattered, particularly if you're in the United States. For many people that live abroad, you were under different agendas, yes, but you still are affected by these events that happened in America because America was the leader of the current world order. For people my age and born after, we were just born into all this. We would not have a clue of what was actually happening. We were just being directed by our parents and grandparents who were very clearly highly deceived and controlled by a system built around falsehoods, lies, and manipulations. As we grow up through all of this, we were directly targeted later, and we came against our own programming. But the thing is that we are in a powerful position today because we were not held to the original mental programming that our parents were under. We were just followers of that generation, and so our mind control is easier to break free from because we don't have to start with breaking from the mind control of the system, but breaking free from the mind control of our parents and that baby boomer generation. Again, much of this, it was not their faults, but unfortunately, it's very hard to break many of them free from it today. They don't want to hear about any of it. There are many baby boomers that watch these videos, and it is encouraging to see the mental release that they all have. But as a majority, our parents' generation, these baby boomers, were directed and steered in a false reality that we cannot afford to live in. As we break free from the programming that they had us under, we then can go back and scrutinize all of our thoughts and how we got to the point in our life that we are each at personally. We as a population are under heavy, severe mind control, and it is important that we wake up from it if we desire to move into our Father's kingdom. People today are disillusioned with false religion and false ideals in mainstream Christianity because they have been following the world more than they are following our Father. We must get off that train, and we must right those wrongs. We must follow our Father more and reject this world, and when we do that, that comes with opposition, rejection, and isolation. It is not easy, but it must be done. It is not an easy thing to go against the wiles of the devil. And so I want you to remember, as scripture says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Adon and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of Elohim, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of Elohim, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." That's Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. As we break all this down, please don't forget that though these things are being waged in the flesh, and you can see these attacks personally, please do not ever forget the spiritual nature of what is going on. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Elohim for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Messiah. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. So please, Keep Yah at the center of your thoughts and continue to bring your thoughts into obedience of Him. The purpose of this series is not to give you a history lesson, but to help you see through the influence of the puppet masters who have been trying to lead us into rebellion and acceptance of Satan. Everything that we have been walking through has been one direct path to Satan, and it is highly important that you do not follow that path. Remember, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. You see, the narrow gate is difficult, which is why there are few who find it. But it is prophesied that there will be people that do. It is my hopes that we are the ones who the scriptures have foreseen and speak about. And what is required in order for this to happen is our sincere and true love of Yahuah and our desire to put Him first in our lives, which then results in a rejection of the wicked and the rebellion that they promote. We must wake up and live in a sound mind, and this is why we must break out of the mind control. There is a lot more to cover because now that Reagan has been introduced into our society, the next phase in the loss of our values enters in. The idolatrous nature that the majority of the world lives through right now starts after this agenda with Reagan takes hold, so we need to walk through it. But by now, since we have entered the 80s, you can now walk through our history since the televisions made it into our homes, and you can now see how you are programmed into the matrix. And with that realization, Yahuah is giving you a way to escape it if you ask Him to. Pray to Him for wisdom and for a sound mind, and He will free you if you put Him first. Please know and understand that the choice has always been yours to make. Make the right choice and decision today. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please make sure to like it and share this video with others. If you have not done so already, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Please make sure to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. I again want to thank everyone who is sowing into this ministry. I feel very humbled by this assignment Yahuah has given me. Your support truly blesses this ministry. I thank you for assisting me with carrying it out and serving Him. I'm truly grateful for you. You know who you are. Thank you again for your support in allowing Yahuah to work through you. May Yah bless you. Okay, thanks again everyone for watching. I love you all.